It's Friday, November 28th, 2025. I'm Josh Rollerson, and this is Pennsylvania Legacies, the podcast from the Pennsylvania Environmental Council. When Ta Enos left rural northwestern Pennsylvania for college, she didn't think she'd be back. She didn't expect the region to become the focus of an ambitious state-level economic development campaign, much less one based on outdoor recreation. She definitely never thought she'd be the one leading that effort. But more than 20 years later, the Pennsylvania Wilds is making a comeback. And the PA Wild Center for Entrepreneurship, the nonprofit organization Ta Enos founded and still leads, is at the heart of it. How she got there is the subject of Ta's new book, published this fall by Catamount Press. Proudly Made, a story of reinvention in the big woods and small towns of the Pennsylvania wilds. The book is full of insights that will inspire others working to revitalize post-industrial communities using nature-based strategies. It is, however, much more than that, too. It's also the story of Ta's personal journey, which led her to the even wilder wilds of Alaska, and from there around the world as a journalist. Ultimately, right back where she started in rural PA. There, she found the purpose her life was missing and the direction her home region desperately needed. She's here today to tell that story, which just earned her the Governor's Keystone Award at last month's Pennsylvania State Dinner in Harrisburg. Ta, congratulations and welcome back to Pennsylvania Legacies.
Josh, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
So, Proudly Made, this is the story of the PA Wilds, and as such, there's a lot of angles to it. It's a story about history. It's about nature and ecology and outdoor recreation. You could have come at this any number of ways. It could have just been a straight, journalistic study of social and demographic change. It could have been an economic development case study. But the approach that you chose was through your own personal experience and your family's experience in the region. Why that approach? Why did you come at this as a memoir?
Sure, that's a great question. I was just talking about this with another writer friend of mine who actually worked for the Wilds for a while. And if you know about the Wilds, it's a big landscape. So if you're driving from one side to the other, it's like 4 hours in a car. So back in the day, we spent a lot of time, even, 10 years ago, I was talking about writing this book and we spent these length of time in the car. And so really sort of talked about this for a number of years before it really came to. And so I wrestled with this question very early on. My background is in journalism. I was a journalist for 10 years. So there was this part of me that wanted to tell this journalistic story. But there was also, as I started to go through it, I really felt like the most important story that I was trying to tell was really trying to share this work with the people who live here and the people from other places similar to ours that are trying to do this work in their own place. I feel like those are two of my key audiences. That I had, you always have an audience in your mind as you're writing. And so those were my two key audiences. And when I thought about those audiences, I just thought, the story that will resonate most is the personal story, right? Of trying to do this work, of coming at it the way I did, which was a little skeptical in the beginning and with these journalistic guys like what's going on here and can this work, and then really living it first through small business and then living it in my community, trying to do the work on the ground through a grant funded position, and then really leaning into it and saying, okay, I have to found this nonprofit to carry this meaningful work forward that's working. So that was quite a journey that I went on. I did not set out to found a nonprofit and be the backbone organization for this regional effort. That was nowhere in my career plan. So it was a real journey for me. And I felt like the story that's going to resonate most with the audiences I care most about are the stories, the personal story of what it took to do that. And so the other audience I think I had in mind were women, right? A lot of the leadership that you see in a lot of these places, it is women leaning into this work in a big way. You see that a lot in the nonprofit sector anyways, but in this kind of work in particular, and that's not at all to discount the great contributions that others have brought as well. But I just felt like it's a woman's story as well. And reaching that audience too, I felt like telling the personal story would hopefully inspire others
Yeah.
to lean into their, their skills and their contributions that they have to give.
I mean, I love that about this book that like you've got these stories of meetings and reports and just kind of, dry bureaucratic encounters with people, but it's all intercut with these really warm personal stories and in a way that weaves together those details into one narrative. Like you're doing this with the people in your family and your community. It's about them as much as it's about anything else.
Yeah, at the end of the day, this is work that has had so many hands. And so I know that I'm sort of in the wilds, right? Like I'm kind of the public face of this thing. And now there's more of us because we've built a staff. And so there's many, many faces, or at least a handful of us now. But, I was at it very early on, but it was in no way, there was always this perception that it was like one person leading this thing, or a misperception, I should say, about that. And there were all these behind the scenes, there were all these people contributing, and you just couldn't really see it. In rural places, there's not as much media, there's not as much connectivity. And so you could see something happening in your one place. A lot of times I think the habit in a distressed place that has seen sort of a lack of investment for so many years is to kind of take any win and minimize it. Oh, that's just one small business. That's just Joe that did this thing, or Alice that did this other thing. And yeah, it's cool, but it's just our small town. And so you take these wins that are like really remarkable and you kind of minimize them. And so my hope with this book was we shouldn't minimize. We should be expanding our story, and telling that story in a bigger, fuller way, and really trying to lift up the incredible pride that goes along with it, and the amazing work by so many people that have got it where it needs to go. If you read the acknowledgments in the book, they're like super long, and the acknowledgments took me forever because I'm like, how am I going to thank? I mean, if you start trying to name like every person, you're going to get yourself in trouble because you're going to forget some names, or like, and the thing about the Wilds work is you don't even know all the people. Like I've been at this 20 years, and people still come up to me and tell me about moments when they contributed something that really meant something to them and made this difference in their community. And I had absolutely no visibility on it. So like 20 years in, I'm still learning like the rich history of like all of the contributions of so many people. But really just trying to, I guess that's one of the underlying themes, is like there is so much power in working together. And I don't mean that in a kumbaya, like silly kind of way. It's like, it's real. Like there's power in numbers and there's power in collaboration. And it is a way to lift up these rural communities.
And you flag a lot of those little moments where something that someone said on TV or in a book or something made an impression on you that, altered your course. That person may never know it, or maybe years later, you would meet them and get to tell the story. You see that happening on both sides of what you're doing. People are being affected by your work and vice versa.
Yes, absolutely. And it is this sort of thing that kind of folds on itself and amplifies. It's been really neat to hear from readers, both here and in other places, that have taken some piece of this and been inspired by it, right? So, all through my book, I talk about this wisdom, right? That all these, and it's all manner of characters, it's like the most local, kind of gritty, or governors, or very high up people at businesses, and everybody in between, right? Is like there are these wisdoms that the collective has around this work and what needs to move it forward. And I take those, I see them as these like little clues, and I put them in my pocket, right? And they like inspire me later on as I'm really facing some challenge and I recall some of those things. I'm just really grateful for everybody's contributions. I know it's a cliche, but it takes a village. It
Sure.
really does.
I'm really curious to hear kind of what people are making of the book, like what response you've heard from it. But before we go there, I think maybe we should back up and fill in some of the backstory for those who haven't yet read the book.
Sure.
A little synopsis, I guess, starting with your childhood. And I know you lived in a bunch of places, but when you were growing up in rural Pennsylvania, how did you think about the area that you called home? It was before there was a PA Wilds, as a brand, but did you have any sense of the Wilds as a place, as some place that people might come to visit?
Not at all. I grew up in the wilds. I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was stunning. I spent a lot of time outside in the woods. And I grew up in a time in rural Pennsylvania where it was just decline. It was, you were seeing a lot of contraction, industry closed, businesses closed, schools closed, people moving away. It's a backdrop to grow up against, right? Is that you see everything sort of contracting and shutting down. And so, I did not really see a future for myself here back then, right? It wasn't that I didn't think it was beautiful or the people weren't super kind, or I just couldn't see an economic future for myself here. And my family did move away. I was raised by a single mom with three kids, and my sisters and I, we all left. And then it wasn't until I had a first career in journalism and then moved back. And my sister actually is the one who kind of pulled me back. She had read about, at that time, the PA Wild's work had just launched. She was an air traffic controller in the Navy, and I was a reporter. We were both at sort of these crossroads with our careers, like, is this what we want to do for the rest of our lives? I was living in Alaska at the time. She had moved to Alaska, and she was looking for pathways to move back home. It wasn't like they were going to need an air traffic controller here. She had found this study at that time. It was the recreation plan for state parks and state forests in the Pennsylvania wilds, which was one of the first big studies that DCNR did when the wilds work first launched. And she had stayed up half the night reading that. And she called me the next day and was like, oh my gosh, there's this thing back home. It's called the Pennsylvania Wilds. It makes so much sense. And so she did end up moving home. She bought Allegheny Outfitters and has grown that business tremendously. She was the braver one. She went first, and I eventually followed her and helped her with her business. And so it was sort of like the PA Wild's work was happening in the background, but we were really just focused on trying to grow this outdoor recreation business through these principles that they were talking about, that this idea that there are these groups of people that are, travelers that are going to want to come to a place like rural Pennsylvania and have these experiences. And so we lived it, right? And I saw her grow that business from 1,200 paddlers a season to over 10,000 a season. And it was like, oh my gosh, this works. And even beyond like what she did with her own business, it was the spark that she became in the community and how that was contagious, with like others and their ideas. And so at a certain point, they had an opening for the PA Wilds work for a small business ombudsman, and they wanted somebody. It was still very fledgling back then, and they wanted somebody to travel across the region talking to entrepreneurs about how this could work. And I was like, I should apply. I should apply for that because I have a communications background and I've seen that this can work. Like I've seen it firsthand helping my sister with her business. So the rest from there is really kind of history. It's just for 5 years, that's what I did. I traveled the region working with these entrepreneurs, and got really inspired. And then just realized like this work is so powerful and so important to the future of rural Pennsylvania. And it's really important that we're very intentional with it. There's a lot of ways to get tourism wrong, and you have to be very intentional how you go about it to prevent some of those bad outcomes and make sure you have good ones. It was very clear to a lot of us that there needs to be like an organization that can house it. And so, the first half of the book is really me growing up and my upbringing, and the second half of the book is me arriving at this place and realizing somebody has to do this. And for a good 2 years, I want to say, I just kind of looked around like, why don't you do it? Why don't you do it? Why don't you do it? Why don't you? And then you look in the mirror and you're like, oh, wait, I have to do it. That's what's going on here. Like, I have to lean into it. I have to be like, show my own leadership here. And it's scary. I was a very reluctant leader. You get nervous. You step up, and are people going to like you? They're going to like throw tomatoes at you. What if, and it's very intimidating, this idea of standing up an entire organization, raising millions of dollars for the cause, the systems and processes and audits and like all the things you have to like. I didn't have any of that background. So it was this journey for me of like arriving there. And so the book is that journey. And then it's about like, oh my gosh, it's the best decision I ever made. And it's done so much good. This work has done so much good. And my hope and my goal is to have it live on beyond any of us, right?
Well, and even though you didn't have that background at the time, or you didn't think you did, it seems like a big part of the reason that you were, in fact, the right person in the right place at the right time had to do with your, kind of journey leading up to that. And this, your whole boomerang story, you have perspectives that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And in particular, you talked about the journalism background. How did that prepare you to lead a redevelopment effort? What were the skills? And for no particular reason, as someone with a journalism background,
Yeah, no,
how do you parlay that?
actually, that's a fantastic question, and nobody's ever asked me that one, so I'm glad you did. I feel like journalism was one of the best preparations for this, right? Because one, you have to learn to synthesize information so quickly. I work for a daily for a big part of my career, and so it was like this boot camp of just like you go out, you report the story, you come back, you put it all on the page, you edit it, and it's all got to be put to bed by, a certain hour that night. There's nothing frivolous about it, right? It's like you are working and you're getting the thing done, you're shipping the work that you need to do. And a lot about rural development is like that. It's like you just need to find really practical ways to work through the information that you have, the opportunities you have, the challenges you have. And it's not about a lot of flair and fanfare and like all these things. It's just going in there and getting the work done that needs to get done and finding a way and finding a solution and finding the way to get it done. The other thing that journalism did for me is I already had this a little bit from moving so much. So part of my backstory as a kid was I was poor, scrappy in a rural place, raised by a single mom. And we moved a lot. I want to say like every 6 months to every year of my life, different school, different apartment, and it was always this idea that you could find something better. I think this is kind of a common thing that happens to some of that like poor working class families from other things that I've read. So I had sort of this, I feel like, wider view of different worlds and things that I was exposed to just by moving around and always being the new kid and kind of always being new. You're kind of just like open to listening more and examining systems and things like that because you're the new person walking in, you're trying to figure it out. So I had some of that, and then journalism really opened that up in the way that you're really going in and you get to have these conversations with everybody from like the corporate CEO to the homeless person on the street, and everything in between. And you're learning these backstories and how people arrive where they've arrived and the systems that have helped them get there or not helped them get there. All of those are really helpful when you're trying to do rural development. And that's ultimately what the Wilds work is. It's a community and economic development strategy, right? And for us, it's about tourism and outdoor rec because it's place-based. It's about what assets do you have? And for us, we have the greatest concentration of public lands in the Commonwealth here in the Pennsylvania Wilds region. And they're multi-use. There's other industries that operate on them, but we've never really articulated it that way prior to the Wilds work. When you look at these together, this is not just come to our kind. This is like a destination, like 29 state parks, 8 state forests, Pennsylvania's only national forest, 50 state game lands, 2 national wild scenic rivers, the darkest night skies in the country, the largest wild elk herd in the Northeast. I mean, that is a destination. And here, like nobody knew about it, right? Even us, like who live here, never really thought about it in that way. We've always had these assets. It was just about how do we activate them in a new way and do that really responsibly so that we're good stewards of the assets themselves, but also good stewards of like our rural culture and way of life and all of those sorts of things.
It was so funny early on in the book where people are beginning to float this idea of a sort of tourism-based strategy, and the one of the objections is, well, we don't, why would anybody come here? We don't have attractions, we don't have amenities. 20 years later, clearly, like this was the brand all along. Like this is where you can get the dark skies. It's this wide open space. It's wild, right? That is the whole appeal, or a big part of the appeal, anyway.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Just this idea, it was a new way of looking at it. It resonated with a lot of people because it's the reason that they love living here. They're just like, and then it became this kind of like, oh, well, we better be careful about this because actually, we don't want too many visitors, right? Like
Right.
you want to make sure that people are responsible when they're here and all of those things. And so there was, in the beginning of this work, it was launched by the state and it was very marketing focused in the beginning. And there was kind of pushback from local communities very early on. And this is before my time, but I'm so glad that they did it because it led to like this reset very in the very earliest years, which was you can't just come in and start marketing the heck out of it. Like you have to have a state of readiness in the on the ground. You have to have some frameworks in place for local voices to help shape what it looks like, all of those things. And so that happened very early in the Wild's work and led to, I think, the genuine partnership that you now see between state and local, between different communities, between the private sector and the public sector around in this, as it relates to this particular work. The other thing I think was really important in the Wild's work was we are not trying to say like tourism is going to replace any other industry. This was more about like our defining issue up here is population loss. We have seen decades of, and we're so rural to begin with. It's a challenge that affects like every place, every sector, every community, every business, every organization, right? Like we're all deal with the same challenges around workforce and it all comes down to kind of population retention. And the beauty of tourism and active recreation is it can really help address those things because it works on that suite of amenities, which, we really need, which is the quality of life. People like to live where there's a vibrant downtown and there's a trail and there's access to these things. And so this industry is the most powerful when it's paired up with other industries. And we're really lucky in the wilds that we have some diversification there, right? Like we still have a manufacturing base. We have resource extraction, even sustainable through our timber industry. We have these other sectors that employ a lot of people and give us some base. And if you're able to grow tourism alongside those, especially in a really meaningful way that fits your culture and your place, I think it can be such a powerful combination and can help communities be more competitive to attract and retain the talent that they need and the families that they need to have that sort of core, right? That we've seen really erode over the last couple of decades. So it was a good approach at the right time in a place with the kind of assets that we have. It made so much sense.
It seems also that, the fact that timbering is being done more sustainably now must have something to do with the fact that tourism is part of the mix now and there's a visibility that wasn't there before. This diversity that you talked about, the various sectors of the economy kind of reinforce and complement one another in some ways. One of the other surprising things was that early on in this process, one of the objections, one of the concerns was not that this marketing wouldn't work and people wouldn't come, but that it would work too well and that there would be impacts that have to be anticipated from that, and not just that it would sort of change the character and make the area seem touristy or whatever, but that there would be environmental impacts specifically from tourism. And that was part of the conversation really early on. I think that's what you were talking about when you said you were glad that there was pushback. I'm curious about how over time that piece of it has played out. How have you navigated those, concerns about potential environmental impacts, especially compared to other places that haven't had that kind of forethought and consideration?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple of things. One, I think it's a job that's never done, right? And that is something to know. And it's not done by one organization at all. The mechanisms for land use planning and all of those things are so outside of our control. There's education at multiple levels as an industry, as a sector, and multiple levels, both public, private, and nonprofit spaces have a role to play. And like I said, it's never done because as tourism grows, things shift, they change, trends change. So you just have to constantly be stewarding it, right? Like stewardship is a huge part of this work. It's woven into everything that we do at the center. And a lot of that guidance does come from sort of the early frameworks that were set up by the core people that were on the ground when this all began, right? And so much of what you can see that we've built draws direct lines back to those early community conversations about what are our concerns about growing tourism in this region and et cetera. So some of the things that we have done and continue to do right now, one is stewardship messaging. Like it's in all our advertising, it's in our marketing, it's in our storytelling. And I forgot to mention the one thing, journalism from before that you talk, like, how does journalism affect this work? Storytelling, right? Like we do a ton of storytelling in the wilds, and journalism definitely impacted that. But back to your question, telling accurate stories about the region and about the sense of place, I think is a really important piece of it. Weaving in the stewardship messaging, leave no trace, like all of those sorts of tactics. Larger sort of systems level, the PA What's planning team, they're our stakeholder group. They're an intergovernmental cooperative agreement that was put in place back in 2007. And it brings all our counties together around this work, a bunch of nonprofits, state partners, et cetera. And they put in place very early on something called the PA Wild's Design Guide for Community Character Stewardship. And it's basically a voluntary planning resource for communities, developers, anybody that's doing or other industries that are saying like, we're going to be operating in this place. How do we do it in a way that fits the character of the place so that we're not changing the character as we grow? There's a distinct feel you get when you drive through our part of rural Pennsylvania. And we want to be very respectful of that, as just as respectful as we're being of the natural resources themselves. How do we lift up that community character and make sure we're good stewards of that? So those are important pieces. I think the most important buffer for tourism not being extractive is the focus that we have on local entrepreneurship. So when people spend money in a community, if you spend it at a chain, and I know chains have their place, I'm not saying that they don't, but if you spend it at a chain, like a big part of that is sort of like vacuumed out of your community, right? This gets very amplified in rural communities because so much of the ownership, the local ownership, has disappeared as big boxes and different things have moved in. It's sort of like pulled wealth and agency and power and all of that out of rural communities. And so the idea is like, how do we reverse that? How do we start to put that back in? Early on in the Wild's work, what they said is we do not want tourism to be extractive as we're launching all of this stuff. So how do we make sure it's not extractive? And the thing that they said is there has to be a major focus of the work on local entrepreneurs, because then when a visitor spends money and it's spent at that local business, that dollar circulates in that rural economy, supporting that business, their family, other local businesses. It circulates like so much longer and has so much more impact. And that little business is never going to be like outsourced to China. It's going to be rooted there in that community and become this engine for job and wealth creation. So the idea of investing in local entrepreneurs, we have invested hugely heavily in that in the Wilds region through this work and continue to do so. And pretty much everything that we've built today, you can draw a direct line back to those early conversations where that was identified as a strategy.
Including the fact that you are the PA Wild Center for Entrepreneurship. Like that's pretty
Yes,
clearly in
yes.
the DNA. I love that so much of this story is told through the stories of people that came and took a chance and did a crazy thing. And in particular, I just have to mention that your sister plays such an important role in the story. I love because it dawned on me halfway through that I know who she is. I think Peck gave an award to Allegheny Outfitters a few years ago, so like she was familiar to me. And when I made the connection, it was just so cool to realize that you guys are your family. But I wanted to talk more about entrepreneurship, not just as an economic strategy, but something about the psychology of entrepreneurship is important to what you've been doing. Could you say more about sort of changing the mindset that you encountered early on through these sort of risk-taking visionary enterprises that people were undertaking?
Yeah, I so appreciate that question. There's sort of two things. There's one, being an entrepreneur, right? Like that's the act of, standing up something like a business, like a nonprofit. And then there's an entrepreneurial mindset. And an entrepreneurial mindset to me is so critical to work like this. And I think you find it in places that you don't expect to. You can find it in government, you can find it in nonprofits, you can find it in business, you can find it in all of these spaces. Those are the spaces where like the real change can happen, because it does take, there's an element of risk, there's an element of innovation, of iteration, of this approach of like you just start. I'm not saying you don't research or do your due diligence on something. You do that, but at a certain point, it's like like get out of the chair and like get your feet on the ground and start moving. And the biggest lessons and the biggest impacts are going to come once you start. And that you can iterate as you go and to not be afraid of that, right? To not be so risk averse that you're like, well, what if it doesn't work? Well, what if it doesn't? I have to say, there is a ton of forgiveness and courage and respect that comes out of vulnerability and of trying and of showing up. There's a lot of people that you think are going to point fingers, or that's like you're catastrophizing in your head about some risk you're taking or some approach you're taking that might not work. And even if it doesn't work, people oftentimes will respect you for trying and getting it as far as you could. And there's usually some lessons that come out of it that move the dial a little bit more and get you to the next place. The mindset that we've had to overcome and continue to have to overcome in a place that has seen a lot of divestment is the scarcity mindset, right? It's this idea that there's only so much and whatever's here is finite and we all need to fight over it, right? Instead of focusing your efforts on let's just make a bigger pie, right? So that everybody can have a bigger slice. Tourism and outdoor rec, beautifully, you can have a bigger pie because you're bringing dollars in from outside, you're doing approaches that pull resources in. And because of the multiplier effect these things can have in communities, right? By working on a suite of amenities, now your major employer is able to get that talent that they need that then can amplify their business. So there's all of these kind of multipliers around it. It's this beautiful sort of exponential model that can happen. I will never forget the time I was over in Kane and the West Penn Fund at the time was putting an enormous investment into a passive house demonstration project, redoing an entire building on their main street, that runs through their uptown is what they call their downtown. Cindy Dunn was there, Secretary Dunn was there. And I remember the head of the fund, looked right at Cindy and said, the state's investments in this work over this number of years, the center's investments in this work over these, like it inspires us. It gives us the confidence to make our own investments in this work. Now, I don't think anybody looks at that investment in Kane in this building and says, oh, that's a tourism investment. But I'll tell you, this work drove that investment. And that's just one. There's like dozens and dozens of these at this point across our region. And that's what I mean by multiplier, that you can use work like this to attract investment, like real investment that your community cares about and wants to see happen beyond just the investments it wants to see happen in like tourism type amenities. And those are really important too. I'm not trying to discredit those. I'm just saying it has these multipliers beyond tourism that are really incredible.
This is the definition of community, though. The whole reason that, there is some of the risk is taken out of it is the fact that there is a sort of common cause and people are more likely to want to support one another. You're not saying, I'm going to launch an enterprise because I think I can make money on the global market or whatever. It's like, this is the time and this is the place. And I'm going to invest my resources here. That is going to benefit everyone else. And in exchange, I'm going to get some security. I'm going to get some support from my neighbors because we all have this shared, vision.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is a book that has a lot of wisdom and tips and tricks, I guess, maybe for other regions and other communities that are in a similar situation. And more places are waking up to the potential of nature-based economic development and everything that entails. You've been in a lot of places, reporting, living, you have a broad perspective. And I'm curious what you think other regions can make of this book, what people can learn from the PA wilds.
That's a great question. A couple of things. I think the broader, the more global things that can be learned are there's power in working together, that it's real. It's not like some, I don't know, fluffy thing. There is real leverage points that can be had by figuring out how do we work together more seamlessly across a lot of different sectors, a lot of different geographies, a lot of different backgrounds, public, private, municipal. It takes a lot of tools in the toolbox to do this work. So that, of course, is like one lesson. Another one I'm really trying to send, and I hope folks get out of the book, is just that like rural places are really investable. There's incredible innovation. There's a headline that came out of the Kauffman Foundation a couple of years ago for an article they did, and it was sort of like rural America is one of the most innovative places. After decades of divestment, rural America is one of the most innovative places. And I would 100% agree with that, that you find so many problem solvers out here because you've sort of been forced into this space, right? Of not a lot of resources. And so there's a lot of incredible thinkers and doers in a rural place. And so folks that are looking for investments to make, I think that there are these anchor organizations in rural landscapes that know how to get money to the ground for good projects and good approaches. So really opening, I'm hoping sort of like the philanthropic sector and other investors to start looking at rural places with new eyes, and move some of those monies to those kinds of places that can have such a return on investment and big impact. And then I would say the value of knowing your story and trusting yourself to lean into leadership. And that's just for like any ordinary person like myself that was sort of like questioning like, oh, do I have to wait for permission for somebody to say that I can lead this thing? You know, in your heart and in your gut, oftentimes when you need to do something, and it can be really scary to take that step, but like take that step. If your heart is telling you that you need to take that step, I would really encourage folks to do that. So I hope to get some inspiration from my story of reluctantly stepping into that space and then things that have happened since then. And then lastly, if you're thinking about visiting the Pennsylvania wilds, you should come visit and be respectful when you're here.
I certainly found the book inspiring. I think that is the virtue of the approach that you took, because there's real substantive information here that people are going to learn from in positions like yours. But anybody can read and understand and be inspired by the text. So congratulations. It's a beautiful book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Josh, and thanks for your time today.
Ta Enos' memoir, Proudly Made, is available to order online, or even better, pick up at one of the many independent bookstores and other small businesses in Pennsylvania that carry it. You can find the list at ta-enos.com, ta-enos.com. We'll have the link in the show notes for this episode at our website, pecpa.org. There you can learn more about the PA Wild Center and its eponymous conservation landscape, one of 8 throughout the Commonwealth where community leaders, businesses, conservation groups, and others are working with DCNR to develop a sustainable and marketable sense of place around tourism and the outdoors. PEC is proud to administer 2 of those conservation landscape programs in the Poconos and the Laurel Highlands. You can help support the PA Wilds by putting a copy of Proudly Made into someone's stocking this holiday season, and you can support worthy nonprofits across the state, including your friends at PEC, with a gift on Giving Tuesday, December 2nd. You can go to pecpa.org/donate, pecpa.org/donate. Your contribution doesn't just support this podcast, it helps to sustain PEC's statewide efforts in conservation, watershed restoration, mineland reforestation, trails and outdoor recreation, and clean energy policy. We can't do this work without the help of our supporters, and we're so grateful for yours. That's all for this episode of Pennsylvania Legacies. For the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, I'm Josh Rawlerson, and thanks for listening.